This isn't like you as an individual firm can solve all of these problems by yourself, right? You can solve some, but not all of them. So I think this collaboration across industry with academia, it has to be the future. We have to do more of it. This is a topic I think we don't talk about enough. We're going to look at models to decisions. We're going to talk about uncertainty. And I remember when 30 years ago, actually, Matthew and I were working together in those days, in the sort of relatively earlier days of CAT modeling, we were still asking questions about uncertainty. And I think if you look at today, the information on the mean is never as interesting as the information on uncertainty. Are we prepared to how to deal with that? Have we got systems in place that can handle that? And then we got things like an overlay of things like behavioral biases. We did a report 10 years ago or so looking at some behavioral biases in catastrophe modeling, and we came up with a list of about 10, things like anchoring as an issue where obviously you're focusing on numbers that just appear from some source or other. Could be a model, could be something else. You've got hindsight bias where after an event we go, yeah, we knew that was going to happen. We were sort of aware of that. Falsely, we think we understand about how history informs our understanding. And one of my favorites, which is mean reversion bias, where we think that actually even in extreme events, things return to a normal distribution, which isn't usually the case. So, Alice, I'd like to start with you. So, given some complexity and uncertainty, how do you try and navigate this tricky path in Inigo, trying to balance model output, insight, information, and underwriting?
So I think it's a really interesting topic, and I think a lot of it comes down to how you try and communicate, and that obviously depends on who your audience is. So when I think about some of the conversations that we might have at board level or at exco level, often they want a point estimate. They want to know what is the maximum loss in a 1 in 200 in Florida or something like that. And their gut isn't necessarily interested in what's the variation around that, what are the assumptions that go into that. So we're forever trying to find new ways of showing it to them, if that makes sense. So we obviously show distributions, which are helpful, but they find that quite abstract. We found that scenarios are much more helpful. So something with a description of an event, what this actually means. They love taking prior events and rerunning those through our portfolio. That really that helps resonate. And then another point is that we spend a lot of our time talking about losses and claims activity, but we're a company, and so trying to extract the result from that as well. So we try and show the distribution. One of the graphs that go in our board pack is we look at the Inigo profit or loss across a range of scenarios, and so we kind of cut the catalogue and we say, imagine the average in global insured loss is 155 billion as per I think Verisk said 6 months ago. Imagine that's 200. Imagine we look at 175 to 225. What does that actually do to Inigo's outcome? And how do we feel about that? What's the sensitivity of our profit? So I think communicating that is the key one. Obviously, underwriters these days, I think, live in a world that isn't point estimates, don't they? Underwriters look at our curves. There's a lot of uncertainty in those themselves, but at least they can see the variability. And the modelers are very much integrated into our teams, which I think is key. They're very much part of how we make those decisions. It's not someone posts it through the letterbox and the numbers there. So I think a lot of it is communication and how you collaborate on this stuff.
I think that's refreshing. I think the issue, one of the issues I always sort of ask is like, where should you collapse the uncertainty? And
never.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, it's tricky though. It's tricky, but I think if you're testing the system with different methods and scenarios, I always think it's really good too. Underestimated generally in our business. That's fantastic. Caroline, what about you're the expert provider of these complex models. I mean, do you feel like you should be playing a greater role in this, or is it down to your clients? Where does the gap between expert modeler and clients fall in that regard?
Yeah, so I think Alice really hit the nail on the head there. It's about communication. So I think it has to be coming from both sides, push and pull. There can be times when sort of, having very in-depth conversations about the level of uncertainty, whether it's, in different parts of the model, the primary, the secondary, and how you actually use that to make your decision can be so overwhelming. We talked about this, is that, you want to be able to actually make decisions at the end of the day with that. But, I think from my perspective of supporting users with the model, I think it's about keeping that conversation about uncertainty very real. So if we, there's a couple of examples from real-time modeling, is just being very upfront about what's in those model losses at the time that they go to our clients, what's not in them, The amount of time that we've needed to generate those scenarios, it can be hours, like literally with the data that we have, it can be very sparse. And so this is why we need ranges, and that those ranges evolve over time, whether it be a day, a week, a year later, as our understanding of those, the nuances of those events kind of evolve. But I think, if we think more about the stochastic models, we're very open and do very deep dives into the individual model components. But I think it's a two-way conversation again about, people using their empirical loss data to actually build their own view of risk there. And again, it's, open to a dialogue between us and the clients on how to, I think, responsibly use that. How am I comparing? I've got maybe 5, 10, 15 years of loss data at best. How do I actually responsibly compare that to a stochastic catalogue of maybe 10, 50, 100,000 years and things like that as well? So again, maybe just lastly, because we talked about some of those human biases, I think there's one that I'd like to share that I think I've noticed over a few years cropping up, and it's this ability of humans to think that a model will give you an output of a rare event. It can say, this is a possibility. But I think very few people actually really accept that that might happen in their working lifetime. And so when you come to think about, this loss, this is maybe a 250 or a 500-year return period on the EP curve, there must be something wrong with the model. I think there's a sort of a really interesting human sort of cognitive bias of being able to deal with that. The model is telling you it's possible, it's rare. But yeah, I think that's an interesting one that I've seen cropping up in conversations.
I mean, I completely agree with you. I think EP curves are not designed for humans. I mean, it's not true. We can understand what they mean in a logical sense, but I think emotionally we just don't really get it. That's why I think scenarios are good. I think one needs to bring these things to life, and I think it's so challenging because this isn't an reinsurance issue. This is a cognitive issue that humans face. I mean, it's well documented. So I think it's challenging, and I think it's actually challenging. Well, this is a question, not a statement. But do you find it's more challenging for you because actually every client is different, and you can go one way with one client and they go fantastic, great, and somebody else will go, whoa, hang on a second, I can't handle this.
I mean, there's definitely differences. I don't know that that's the challenge. I think, for us, we're here to serve everybody depending on your appetite of using and building your own views of risk, right? Or using the models off the shelf. So I think we're open to having the same conversations and providing that same level of detail that's needed for everyone.
Okay, makes sense. So look, tangentially from there, I think one of the other things that I've always found was as odd is that most industries in the world are fed by academia. And actually, catastrophe modeling as a discipline is so unique and has so many idiosyncrasies that are hard to understand in academia that we don't have a very good gap, or a link, I should say, with academia. Now, I know Inigo's done quite a lot to, as Adam was pointing out earlier, has actually done quite a lot to reach out into academia. But you do get a challenge there, right? So you get a version of the truth, which is what you're paying for from these expert modelers who've been around 30, 40 years. And then you get some academic who doesn't understand cat modeling, but they understand about climate science, they understand about, maybe vulnerability or something else. Is that a challenge for you in operating in your organization to try and integrate these things? Or is it more a richness of data that actually adds to the conversation?
I think it is always a challenge. What we try and achieve is a really nice blend of skills at the kind of almost the crossover point, if that makes sense. So you'll have scientists who are operating in their area, and maybe some of those are in-house for us. We have a team, as Adam said, he leads a team. And then we'll have partnerships. So we'll have, whether those are data partnerships or research partnerships. So the ability for those two to be able to interact, I think is really key. And that's, you need to make sure you have that skill set, right? But then bringing it along to us and the decision making, we've got our modeling team who sit alongside the reinsurance team and the underwriters. And if those two things aren't nicely in sync, then nothing's going to happen. You might have some wonderful science, you might have some interesting findings, but you're not actually going to use them at the point of underwriting. So our operating model is to try and embed all of those things, to acknowledge that we can't do this ourselves. It's a kind of collective thing as an industry, right? These are industry questions that we should all want to improve our understanding of together. So, Inigo's not going to say, this is our secret information that we're using only for our own benefit, but just making sure that operating model has quite nice, tight feedback loops. So sometimes in itself that can cause not issues, but you need to be able to navigate it. So the example that I've used a lot recently, because it's very current, is that we did our 25 plan based on one view of risk for US hurricane, for example. And then going into 1/1, we had an updated view of risk. So we're forever looking for the signals, and we have a team that's very nimble and an operating model that can adjust quite quickly. So you adjust it for 1/1, and then since 1/1, we've made another adjustment. Now, as an underwriting lead, I want us to have the current best view of the science. I want that to be incorporated. But obviously having portfolios written on different views is something you have to think about. So making sure we can just extract that as we go along and the impacts of those changes. And a huge part of how we do that is we show underwriters different views, and they're comfortable with that. It's something we talk about a lot. So we might have a kind of Inigo view of risk, which is based on the output from the Verisk model, but then adjusted. You might have a seasonal alternative view of risk if it's Enzo based, for example, like last year. Or you might just have, if you take wildfire, for example, post LA earlier this year, we weren't quite sure what our view of risk would be going forward. We'd already moved on to version 12 for January. So instead, we just had a stress scenario. We didn't know if it was the right one, but we wanted to show it to our underwriters so that they could say, okay, imagine we were 50% out on parts of our curve. What would that actually mean for this underwriting decision that I'm being forced to make today? And I think that is the key, is having these nimble operating models that can react quickly, but you acknowledge what you're doing with that.
Agile, not a word you often hear in the insurance industry, I would say. That's good.
We're trying.
Caroline, is this a threat or opportunity for you? You have a view of risk. Do you mind other people sort of saying we think you're a bit wrong?
We need them.
There's no threat there, really. And to be honest, for a long time now, we've been enabling people within our software as well to customize their view of risk, whether it be through custom frequency, custom vulnerability, various different loss modification factors. We sort of encourage that. And we know it's part of either just natural curiosity. There might be business needs, there might be strategic needs as well. And we want to, we are a model provider, but we're also a software provider. And it would be naive of us to think that we want to serve our clients in this way, right? I think the important part, again, comes back down to that communication. So, there's a different modus operandi between academia and sort of fundamental science, as we call it, that's trying to progress, there's the sort of the innovative leading edge. And perhaps what we do as model providers, we've been working on taking the best of the science and the engineering to apply it specifically to catastrophe models with an output that's aimed to give you decision making, as opposed to just perhaps advancing a science that's not really there's perhaps sort of more wiggle room in terms of understanding deltas, or not having to address the absolute dollar number that's going to come out of their models, for example. Whereas, as a provider of risk analytics, we have to get that right. We have to get that right. It's not acceptable that there would be biases in that. But we have to think about the whole process as well. The implementation. Sometimes we have to make choices, even when things are highly uncertain, because they have to go into a model. There may be times when we have to optimize for implementation. People have to be able to run portfolios of millions of locations in reasonable runtimes. So, where we place uncertainty in our models and some of the assumptions that we take, it's all sometimes with that optimization in mind. So I think, what I would just say is, yes, we're very open to people doing this, but come and talk to us. Come and talk to us so that you understand if you want to tweak this part of the model, has it got any downstream impacts, or should there be a better place where I'm implementing it? Can you check that this is the most optimum way to be implementing this view of risk in the software?
I mean, you've said this very well, but essentially, move aside for a second the software platform element, which is really important. But, actually on the modeling side, you are selling your expert judgment of a view of risk. That doesn't preclude your clients from having their own view of risk.
Absolutely not.
Right. There's not a conflict there at all. I want to just move to one last question, which is look into the future. And I think really I want to focus this on skills. So We've many of us have been in this industry quite a long time, and if we're half decent, we've evolved our skills a little bit, but we've seen some fairly significant sea changes, I would say, on a global basis. Are we equipped with the skills we have in the teams we work in? Right, I don't mean you individually, right, or me for that matter. But I mean for the teams you've got, are we equipped well enough for the future? And what are the skills we need in the future look like? Or possibly, where are some gaps we need to fill that aren't necessarily human skills? Caroline.
I mean, I think it's really interesting that you bring on our experience there, because I think my point would be is actually investing in our early career CAT analysts and their ability to understand uncertainty, not be fearful of it, and actually work about how do I accelerate the understanding of making decisions within that realm of uncertainty. I think there's a lot of training that goes on for early career CAT analysts, whether it be using software, model deep dives and getting into that, I'm sure, onboarding and operational, but it really is with the aim of getting people as operational as possible, as quick as possible. And I think with that comes a little bit of the institutional knowledge that gets passed down, and this is how we do it, this is how we think, but actually just a bit more basic, wider training for people to understand that there is huge amounts of uncertainty here, and you should be thinking about that with all the different decision making. So I think embedding it more earlier in people's careers would be really helpful.
And you've built a fairly new team, actually. So maybe you've got all the people you need. I don't know, skills you need.
No, never. I think if I look at the skills and operating model, it already looks quite different to when Inigo was established 5 years ago. So that's not just in terms of climate and research. If I think about the number of actuaries that we have, if I think about data scientists, it looks quite different. So the ability, I think, to adjust that as you see gaps is really important. When I think about your question, I think the intersection of climate science and data science is an interesting one. So you're blending skills there. And to my point earlier about partnerships, we have a partnership with I'm going to get this right, ICCS, which is the Institute for Computing and Climate Science in Cambridge. So they've acknowledged that you need to have this skill set over here, which is, ingesting large data sets, data science, obviously some AI as well, alongside people with degrees in physics, people with PhDs in climate science, to be able to further our understanding of that. So an appreciation of that range of skill sets, I think, is quite an important one. If I think about Inigo specifically, something we're talking about a lot at the moment is also the engineering vulnerability side of it. That's a skill set that we have bits of, but we actually haven't, I don't think we've overinvested in yet. We spend a lot of time on the hazard. And if you think about the world in which we're living in as well, when new things are being built, now whether that's renewable energy sources, whether it's just different building codes, I think the ability to be able to understand how that risk evolves as well is probably quite an important one for us too.
And I think if I just want to add one thing, because I know you're involved with this, corporately, but I really see a role for pre-competitive collaboration as a way of solving problems in complex systems. I mean, it's a well-known academic sort of sphere, actually. And the insurance industry it likes to think generally it's quite good at this. I think actually it's not very good at this. You're quite good at this, actually. So I think that's a good start. We need to do more of that, because actually this isn't like you as an individual firm can solve all of these problems by yourself, right? You can solve some, but not all of them. So I think this collaboration across industry with academia, it has to be the future. We have to do more of it. So look, I think that's fantastic. I think this is such a good topic, rarely talked about on a stage. So many thanks to both of you for doing that. Please thank our speakers. It's much appreciated. Thank you.